Welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm Shafiqullah Aziz and you're with the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. We're just going to give a minute for the attendees to populate our list, and we'll get started in just a second. Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar today, organized by the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. The topic of our webinar today is trauma responses with Indigenous youth. We are joined today by our two presenters, Brittany Vince and Brittany Madigan from the Aboriginal Health Center in Hamilton, Ontario. Just a note, participants are muted on the call. You are in listen-only mode. We will be taking questions at the end of our webinar, so please use the question function to type in your questions and we will take them up starting around 1:45 or so. The webinar is also being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our website at campusmentalhealth.ca. We will also have a short survey that you can complete after the webinar, so please take a couple minutes to give us your feedback. We always find that very useful for our purposes. I would like to start by introducing myself. My name is Shafiqullah Aziz, and I am the Stakeholder Engagement and Communications Coordinator for the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. Our two presenters today, Brittany Madigan and Brittany Vince, I'll just go ahead and read a little bio. Thank you for joining us today. So Brittany Madigan identifies as Mohawk of Kahnawake and Canadian. She has a Master of Social Work, a Bachelor of Social Work, and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from McMaster University. Brittany has enjoyed working with Indigenous children, youth, and their families for 5 years. She has also worked with people experiencing homelessness, people with developmental disabilities, and youth mentorship programs. Brittany is currently a child and youth mental health counselor, registered social worker at the Aboriginal Health Center. She lives in Hamilton with her husband and is a mother of 2 dogs and a horse, and in her spare time she enjoys horseback riding, fitness, reading, music, and spending time with loved ones. Thanks for joining us today, Brittany. Brittany Vince is of Haudenosaunee from Six Nations, Cayuga Nation, and Canadian, non-native Scottish and English ancestry. Brittany completed the social service worker program through Mohawk College and went on to complete her concurrent degree in social work and sociology through McMaster University. Brittany is currently enrolled in the Master of Social Work program through Wilfrid Laurier University in the Aboriginal field of study. Brittany has worked with the Hamilton, Brantford, Six Nations, and New Credit communities and brings various experiences with her from the areas of street-involved youth services, crisis and counseling services for abused women and their children, group work and programming with children and youth, pediatric mental health in a hospital setting, and child welfare services with Indigenous children and their families. Brittany is currently employed as a child and youth mental health counselor at the Aboriginal Health Center in Brantford, Ontario, and is a registered social worker with the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. Thank you for joining us today, Brittany and Brittany. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to the two of you, and you can go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So we just thought we'd start by just telling you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We'll go to the next slide. Can you switch to the slide for me? So as we said, we are child and youth mental health counselors at the Aboriginal Health Center. We're both registered social workers as well. So we work with children and youth between the ages of 6 to 24. And we have sites in both Hamilton and in Brantford. So for the most part, we do individual counseling. We've also done some groups as well, and we work in a very interdisciplinary setting. So we have primary care, health promotions, all kinds of things that go on. Traditional healing, for sure. We have all kinds of different training that we've done as well. Some of that includes training in trauma counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, play therapy, and dialectical behavior therapy as well. So just to get started, we thought that we would just ask our first polling question, just to kind of get the ball rolling. And we were wondering if people would have an idea of what is the main issue facing Indigenous people. So I'm not sure if we're able to get the poll up. Perfect, yeah. So A is addictions and mental health, B is health disparities, C is poverty, and D is trauma. So if you could just choose which one that you think might be the biggest issue for Indigenous people today. I'm not sure if we see what people are answering. Yeah.
We'll just, most people have voted up until this point. There's just about 25% remaining having to vote, so we'll give folks another 15 or 20 seconds.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll be closing the poll in a few seconds. All right. So the results of the poll, 24% selected addictions and mental health, 9% selected health disparities, 16% selected poverty, and 52% selected trauma.
Awesome. And really, no one's wrong because those are all super large issues. But trauma was the answer that we were thinking of, because really trauma is related to all of those things. And so speaking of trauma, I just wanted to briefly go through colonization and what that has looked like. Hopefully this is something that most people are aware of, but we just wanted to make sure we had all of our bases covered, and just make sure that we did this quickly. We can't go over everything, of course, because there isn't enough time, but just a kind of brief overview of it.
Especially because the audience seems to be so diverse, so we just want to make sure that everyone has a bit of an understanding.
Yeah, for sure. So since colonization, one of the first things that happened was disease really reduced the Aboriginal population quite a bit. The Indian Act in 1876 was an unfortunately very racist piece of policy. One of the things that did was move Indigenous people into reserves, and that was very problematic for people, as it took away their nomadic way of life, moved them from sacred land to remote places where they often didn't have access to various resources. Residential school was another big part of that as well. And I think this is a good time actually to do our second polling question, if that's okay. So this question is just to get a sense of what people know about this school. So we're wondering what percent of residential school survivors were sexually abused. So we have A, 25%, B, 72%, C, 44%, and D, 90%. So if we could get people to just...
I think that's the wrong polling question that they had up there.
Oh, was that?
Okay, so we're just going to give a minute.
Sure.
If you can bring it up.
Okay, so we actually just had that second polling question there. So this was the results. Okay.
So are we able to use the chat option just for right now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So perhaps instead what we can do is we'll ask that question again, and then maybe we can get people to answer using the chat option, just saying what, whether they just write A, B, C, or D in the chat option, just to get an idea of where people are at with some of their knowledge about this. So the question was, what percent of residential school survivors were sexually abused? And so A is 25%, B is 72%, C is 44%, and D is 90%. So if you could just comment the letter or even the percentage, whichever, in the chat option, and then we can get an idea of what people's thoughts are. If I can open that. Let's see. sure if I see people. Yeah. Okay, if I do that.
So if folks want to just go ahead and type in their responses into the chat function addressed to the entire audience. And if the two of you wouldn't mind just restating the possible answers. So A is 25%.
Yeah, A is 25%, B is 72%, C is 44%, and D is 90%. Maybe we'll just skip the next one.
Okay, we're going to take a minute. Just trying to see if we can.
Yeah, we're just having trouble seeing people's responses to it.
Okay, maybe we can go ahead and just skip that question for now.
Okay, so the answer to that question is actually D. So it's almost 90% of people were sexually abused there. So the residential school system, it went from about to the 1850s to 1990, sorry, to 1996 actually is when the last residential school was closed. It resulted in a huge loss of culture for Indigenous people, loss of language. Children weren't able to speak their own languages, lack of identity, so people really lost a sense of who they are. And again, the sexual abuse and physical abuse were widespread. About half the children who went there died and were often placed in unmarked graves. And attachment was a big piece too. So they were taken away from their own family, their own homes, and had very little contact. So it left communities behind with no children as well, and just a general feeling of despair. And unfortunately, many people turned to alcohol to cope. The other thing that we wanted to talk about too briefly was the 60s scoop. So this was a time in around the 1960s, although really it spanned kind of before and after that as well. But this was a time when thousands of Indigenous children were removed from their homes and placed into non-Indigenous homes, often very far away from their homes. And the assumption was that families were unable to care for their children. However, Children's Aid wasn't thinking about the impact of residential school, colonization, and how that has impacted people, and unfortunately kind of re-oppressed and continued to provide the same kind of damage that residential school did as well. Mm-hmm. There's also been, sorry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just that the 60s scoop, like kind of the ideology behind that was that if you were a Native person, you were a lesser parent. So that was kind of the racist ideology at the time, were so many children that were Indigenous, it was just an overrepresentation, and still is to date, but very much so during the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, for sure. There's also been many racist laws, unfortunately, in Canadian history. So, for example, Aboriginal women used to lose their status if they were to marry a non-Indigenous person. At the same time, a non-Indigenous woman, if she married an Indigenous man, she would gain status. And there's many women today who are still trying to gain that status back. Another example is that Indigenous people used to lose their status if they attended education beyond high school. And again, it was that idea that if you were to be educated, that you were then civilized and so wouldn't be Indigenous anymore. There was also times when ceremonies have been outlawed, and so people would have to do ceremonies in private and hide what they were doing, and that was a huge loss as well. And unfortunately, there are still current policies that disadvantage Aboriginal communities. Aboriginal communities are often underfunded and are still ultimately controlled by the Canadian government as well. Mm-hmm. Is it possible just to do our last poll for this one? We just wanted to know if anyone learned anything new with this info that we just talked about here. We were wondering if people could just say A for yes, if they did learn anything new, and B for no, if this was all things that they knew already.
Okay, so we'll give another 15 seconds.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, the poll will be closing in a few seconds. All right. So pretty much split down the middle. 53% yes, 47% no.
Okay, great. So
Awesome.
it's good that we did provide a little bit of info. And like I said, we just briefly went over it. Of course, there is so much more to all of these points, so much more, and especially with people's stories, as you listen to survivor stories, there's always something different that you might learn that someone has gone through. But we thought we should definitely provide an overview for those that maybe don't work, aren't Indigenous themselves perhaps, maybe aren't working with Indigenous people and really need that background.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So we'll do the next slide. So we just wanted to talk about intergenerational trauma. So hopefully people have heard of this. And what this is basically the transmission of historical oppression to individuals, families, and communities as a whole. So it's really about passing down the trauma and the maladaptive coping patterns that go along with that trauma. So this can include disruption of family, so think about residential school and the children who were taken away, punitive parenting models, so a lot of children didn't learn how to properly parent, lack of attunement from caregivers. So when children were growing up in places where they didn't have that, loving, caring, safe parent, they didn't know how to parent their own children. And then that cycle of abuse, so sexual, emotional, physical abuse, that cycle just keeps going on. And again, just that loss of culture and identity, these are all things that are part of this trauma. So it contributes to mental illness, suicide rates, addictions, violence, and again, just that loss of knowing who people are. So I actually have a few stats here that are related to intergenerational trauma. So Indigenous youth are 3 to 6 times more likely to die by suicide than non-Indigenous youth. So that's a huge gap there. And suicide actually accounts for almost 25% of all deaths among Indigenous youth. I thought it was also very telling that over 90% of residential school survivors have abused alcohol after leaving. So again, I think that just points to the damage that was done there. And unfortunately, 82.6% of residential school survivors have abused an intimate partner. So again, it goes back to the things that they learned there and the coping skills or lack thereof that they learned. And another interesting thing that I found too was that suicide is actually lower in indigenous communities that have more self-governance, more resources, and connection to culture. So it just goes to show that all those things can really help bring these mental health pieces down. Next slide. So PTSD is actually the most commonly diagnosed mental illness for Indigenous people. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about all the things that we've just mentioned. And so this intergenerational trauma, it creates this risk for the insecure attachment. So, again, not knowing, who that safe parent is, and it creates beliefs about yourself and about others that aren't necessarily healthy. So growing up in an environment where you're not feeling safe, you're being abused, you don't know who you are, you tend to have core beliefs that are very negative. So you may think, I'm not worthy of being loved. You may also have some negative beliefs about the world, so feeling like the world is not a safe place to live, feeling like you don't fit in. And when this insecure attachment is existing, it creates a heightened risk that people will have more distress when they are facing trauma. So that just means when someone does go through something very traumatic, say death of a loved one, or a parent leaving, for example, they have a greater risk of having a much harder time dealing with that than someone who doesn't have that attachment piece.
Mm-hmm. And for insecure attachment, there's all different types of insecure attachment, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're not going to be going into that. I'm sure some people who are watching this webinar are aware of attachment theory, but for those who aren't, that might be something that you might be interested in learning a little bit more about. And then PTSD is post-traumatic stress also, for anyone who isn't aware of what that term is. And with this attachment piece, the best way to really think of it in a really simplistic way is just, it's a secure base, right, that usually happens between caregiver and child. And without that secure foundation, it really impacts, that's kind of like a template, for lack of a better term, for the rest of their lives and how they think of themselves, others, in the world. So if someone already has kind of that insecure attachment, they are more likely, when faced with adverse experiences, to have higher levels of distress and be more likely to be traumatized themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So we just wanted to briefly go over what is Indigenous culture and what does that mean. So Indigenous culture is very different from Western culture. So it tends to be more circular, holistic, and we're going to talk about, medicine wheel and that holistic wellness in a bit. But that's contrasted with Western culture, which tends to be very linear, very dominating, and have things in very separate silos. So, for example, mental health and physical health are often very separate. Whereas in Indigenous culture, those would be all in the same kind of balance. So it's very important for Indigenous people to think of our relationships with everything. So with each other, all living beings, with the land is huge as well, and then spirits as well. So the spirit world, spirituality, we're very connected with that as also. We definitely value giving thanks, humbleness. So we tend not to put ourselves above other beings. Sense of humor is always a big part of our culture as well. We like to have fun.
And resilience.
Resilience
is humor and resilience.
Yeah. Living in balance, and then just caring for one. Storytelling is a really important part of our culture as well. So that's how we, pass down wisdom and healing. Sorry, we're on the screen with that. Okay.
I think the internet went out for a minute, but
okay, good. We also, use sharing circles and teaching circles, where it's an opportunity for everyone to share their voices, to hear other people's stories. Ceremony is a huge part of our culture as well, and that can be anything from, doing fasts for days in the bush to a simple smudge, which can take, 30 seconds.
Or giving thanks.
Yeah, or even giving thanks. And role modeling is very important as well. So having elders and those healers who we, really look up to. And the other important thing to note too is that culture and someone's connection with their culture varies greatly. So different nations have different parts of their culture. So for example, some nations do smudge, other nations don't. And then even within nations, there's so much diversity amongst people in terms of how they connect to that also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even in terms of language, right? Like if you go to two different reserves that both speak, say, like Mohawk, there might be certain differences just in kind of the dialect, I guess, for lack of a better term, or different terms in the culture of that place.
Yeah. Okay. So keeping all this in mind, we wanted to talk about what's important for healing from an Indigenous point of view. So that community connection is vital. So this is the foundation on which mental health is built. And so healing from colonization needs to happen at this level as well as the personal level too. So Indigenous people really need to have a clear understanding of their Indigenous identity. So again, that doesn't mean they have to be traditional and follow all these kind of cultural things. It's just whatever that means for that person. But just knowing where they fit in with that is really, really powerful. And needing to approach healing holistically, so looking at all parts of the medicine wheel, looking at the whole person, and how they fit into their world. So the person within the family, within their community. So it's not just that one aspect of that one person. And then the relationship as well. So having a healthy relationship with the counselor, their family, community, it's all about relationships. Yeah. And so part what we do in our work is trying to incorporate two-eyed seeing. And really what that means is from one eye seeing the Indigenous worldview, and from the other eye seeing the Western worldview, and seeing what makes sense in both, and trying to negotiate both ways of seeing the world. And so it's not putting one over the other. So I have actually the Tura Wampum Belt here, which is an agreement that was meant to symbolize the Indigenous people and colonizers traveling in their own vessels. So in the Indigenous people traveling in their canoe, and the colonizers traveling in their ship. They're represented by the purple rose, and they don't cross. They run parallel, and it's meant to symbolize that we would each do our own thing and respect what the other person is doing. And another important part is really seeing the individual again as part of their family, community, and their culture, because trauma is experienced on all of those levels. And then working again on the decolonization. So that's looking at yourself and challenging your assumptions, your beliefs about why you think the way that you do. The knowledge that you know and how you know it. And just going back and remembering and reconnecting with the Indigenous culture. And so it's also important for counselors to do that as well, just to have that critical thinking about their own assumptions and bias and how that might be impacting their work.
Okay, so now we are going to switch gears, and I'm going to take over for the next little while. Just keep me posted for polling questions, because it's the only thing I don't have written down here.
Okay. I don't think we have any other.
Okay, great. So I'm Brittany Vinson. I am the child and youth counselor at the Brantford site. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about how all of this translates into our counseling practice with the children and youth that we see at the health center. So as Brittany said, we definitely look to the medicine wheel as a method of assessment of a client's overall wellness. So instead of seeing mental illness, we're seeing overall wellness. And wellness is something that applies to really everyone. So regardless of whether you are really struggling and in life with, say, addiction or mental health issues that are, really impacting how you function on a day-to-day basis, to say myself and Brittany, to whoever, everyone has a level of wellness, and we should always be taking to be as well in each of those areas. I will pull up the medicine wheel next, so stay tuned for that.
I just wanted to mention that the internet cut off just a little bit, so if you can just repeat the last two sentences that you just said.
Okay, sorry about that. So basically what I just said was that wellness applies to everyone. So this is not something that is just for our clients or for people who are seeking services or for those who are really struggling right now. That this also applies to anyone. So every person has a level of mental wellness or just a general level of wellness altogether. So mental health is not separate from the other areas of wellness, which are physical, spiritual, and emotional. And so we basically see that all these areas correlate and impact one another. Sometimes you might be experiencing a mental health issue, but you really are, along with that, having a physical ailment, or perhaps you're having a spiritual issue that ends up translating into what is seen as a mental health issue. So we really need to be able to look and be a bit more flexible when we are, as counselors, professionals, wherever you may work, or whatever your reason for coming to this webinar is, to just be able to look more in a flexible manner at mental health and what we can actually conceptualize it to be. So I'm going to pull up the medicine wheel next. So this is just an example of the type of an assessment that we would do when we're first seeing a client here at the center. So this is more the issues that they're coming with, but we're always looking for those strengths in all these areas too, and how we can build on those strengths, make them you know, bigger, making them more of assets to help them along with their wellness journey. So as you can see here, we have spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical. So spiritual, you know, you can see there suicidal ideation, attempts, lack of faith, lack of relationships, self-knowing, reckless behavior, adjustment challenges, identity challenges, and having a broken spirit. Mental, some examples are racing thoughts, negative beliefs, challenges with memory, isolation, intrusive images or flashbacks, excessive worry or fear. Emotional, you know, negative feelings, acts of self-harm, historical trauma, negative self-talk, numb or feeling like you have no feelings at all, anger or rage, shifts in mood. And then physical, body pain, medical diagnosis of some sort, lack of self-care or interest, feeling like you're fidgety or you cannot relax, weight loss or gain, sleep disturbance, fear of intimacy, and addiction. And so when we're looking at all these areas, a lot of these tend to be common things that the clients that we're seeing are coming in with, right? So even though someone is coming into to seek out mental health counseling, they might very much be having trouble with sleep, for instance. So if there's any other people out there that work in the mental health field or with trauma or sexual assault or women who have been through violence, they can probably understand that sleep tends to be a huge part of our mental health. So, but that is technically a physical symptom, right? Weight loss or gain, and addiction very much is a physical thing, right? It's meeting a need, it's meeting a function for a bigger issue of someone's overall wellness. And then, of course, the spiritual piece. So the suicidal ideation, one thing people wonder is, why is suicide part of the spiritual part of the medicine wheel? And I think for that one, it's really not wanting to kind of be here in the physical world anymore, really wanting to return to Creator. And so we see that as a spiritual issue and trying to revive that person's will to live and really their role here, not just as a human being, but you know, the role that Creator gave them to be here, if that's what they believe in, of course. Okay, so that's the medicine wheel. So theory and practice, so these are just some of the skills that we use, or some of the perspectives, I should say, that we use in our work. We presented at the McMaster Indigenous Health Conference. We went way in detail, maybe too much about these things, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm just going to describe briefly what these things are, and we're also going to provide some resources at the end, so if anyone is wanting to know more, learn more, that they'll have a place to start to do that. So therapeutic storytelling. So when we're doing trauma work, so we do a lot of trauma work, by the way, if not already mentioned. And so when we're doing trauma work, it's that therapeutic storytelling. It's that idea of witnessing someone's narrative, witnessing someone's story, which is very much in line with an Indigenous perspective of an oral sharing, or you know, the Indigenous practice of storytelling itself, right? So obviously, as an Indigenous people, we realized for a long time now that sharing and telling our stories not only taught others things, but was also therapeutic for us in some manner. So really being able to bear witness to someone's story when they're sharing about a trauma, and being able to do so in a way where you're not challenging or changing their story. This is not the time where you're using CBT strategies. This is not the time when you are asking them to think of it in a different way. This is the time where you're really just bearing witness in a really healthy and supportive manner. And that in itself is so externalizing to the trauma, and that in itself can do a world of a difference. So that is one way we do that. With children, we actually do get them to draw out their trauma as well, which is a sensory motor technique that really tries to connect the body to the experience of trauma along with the cognitive piece of the trauma that the person is remembering, to kind of reconcile and try to you know, to try and reconcile that trauma memory and externalize it in a way that includes, like I said, the body and the mind. Somatic and sensory processing, so it kind of goes into what I just said. So it's the idea that we experience trauma in our bodies, and so trauma really is an experience of the nervous system. So a lot of people might think trauma is about the event itself, and it is not. It is really about how that event has impacted that person on a nervous system level. And so this looks different for each person, but oftentimes you might experience a client who, for instance, has post-traumatic stress. And they might come to you and say, you know I'm safe. I've been safe for a while. This was a long time for me. I've made sense of everything that's going on. I've been able to say to myself, that things are different now, and I'm not going to see that person again. But for some reason, every time I hear loud noises, I all of a sudden shake, I get sweaty, I experience all those symptoms all over again. So this is this idea where the body holds the trauma often. So this is a more holistic idea of working with trauma, and there's a lot more coming out. For instance, Peter Levine is a great resource in some of his books about somatic experiencing and working through trauma on a sensory level. So we will do often things like that with our clients that include sensory pieces. So where are you feeling the trauma right now, being able to locate it in the body, being able to understand how it feels and addressing that. And that would include sensory tools such as stress bands. Yeah, resistance bands. That's what I was thinking of. Yeah. Resistance bands, stress balls, weighted blankets, if anyone's ever heard of those, and how those can be very beneficial, not just to trauma, but all different areas.
Trampoline to jump things out.
Yeah, those types of things. A smudge is just so sensory rich, right? There is so many things that you could be doing based on that developmental level, based on that client's interests and likes and dislikes, that you can really work that into their care plan, right? And work that into how you're going to reconcile that, that experience of trauma in the body with that cognitive piece. Cognitive restructuring and the good mind. So a lot of counselors or just practitioners in general will be very familiar with something called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is just the idea that your feelings and your thoughts and your behaviors are all connected, and if we can try and make some changes in one, then inevitably the other two are going to change as well. So CBT is a very Western modality. However, when we look at the good mind, which is a Haudenosaunee concept, at least from my perspective, I can't speak to other Native cultures who might also adopt something similar, but the good mind is that intention, right? It's that energy that you're putting into your thoughts and your day-to-day thoughts and behaviors, right? So an example of a good mind might be, say you're driving in your car and someone cuts you off, and your automatic reaction might be to swear at them or to think, wow, that person is so bad, they're so mean. They did this to me on purpose, right? Or they did this to wreck my day, and now I'm going to be angry about it. Instead, a good mind would be to bring it back and to say, let's not put that negative energy on that person. Let's think of this in a different way. Can we perhaps think about maybe they're in a rush, maybe someone's sick and they're trying to get to them. Maybe they're just not a skillful driver, and that's okay too. So just being able to have that good intention, that positive intention, and that positive energy. And when you're doing that to others, you're also giving that energy to yourself. So that kind of reminds me of CBT in a number of ways, because you're trying to develop a healthier thinking style. You're trying to behave in a certain way that is in line with your values and is generally going to make you feel better overall. So that's another way that we kind of use both Western and Indigenous modalities. The last one I'm going to touch on is mindfulness and grounding. So there's been a whole mindful movement. I'm sure that lots of people are familiar with this. So it is a tenet of dialectical behavioral therapy. It is on its own a huge movement. You see it a lot with meditation, yoga, all different types of techniques that really encompass this mindfulness, which is really just being in the present consciously without judgment. And there's lots of evidence that would suggest that mindfulness is great for a number of things relating to mental health. And a lot of that can actually be found on the American Psychiatric Association website as well, if you wanted more about why mindfulness is good and why we do it. And then, so that kind of goes into this idea of grounding, right? So really being present with your thoughts, your feelings, and your body is the opposite of something called dissociation, which once again, I cannot get into today, but dissociation is something else that I would very much encourage you to get more information on, simply because it is a huge symptom of trauma And a lot of people do it and aren't able to label it. So grounding is the opposite of dissociating. It's being present mind with your body, with your thoughts, and being able to just be as you are. Being able to calm down that level of arousal. Arousal is another term used often in trauma. If you see someone coming in panicked, anxious, perhaps they're experiencing flashbacks, maybe they're talking a mile a minute, that is a hyper state of arousal. So we want to bring them down, we want to ground them. Perhaps someone is doing the opposite, maybe they have some hypo symptoms, which are more maybe depressed state, really lethargic, sleeping a lot, really struggling with kind of that energy just to get through their day. Maybe we're trying to ground them, but also increase that arousal to some degree. So some great ways to do both mindfulness and grounding could be through guided meditations. It could be something as simple as, can I see that stone actually that you have? If you can see the camera, so this is just like a healing stone that I have here. So an example of a very short activity I might do with someone to start off would be just to get them to hold it, getting them to look at it, getting them to describe what it looks like, you know, color, texture, is there lines, what is interesting about this stone, and being able to say what it feels like as well. And you can do that with really anything. So that could be a healing stone, or that could be a scent. Any of the sensory pieces are just so great for grounding and for mindfulness. So a lot of grounding tools also are rich in the Indigenous culture. So things like beading, like you have to be fully there to be beading. You really have to be, you know, there paying attention, you're feeling the beads, you have your needle in your hand, you're doing it slowly and with your pace, right? Dancing, for example, it really forces you to be present in the moment, to feel Mother Earth on your feet, to be able to hear the music. There's so many different things that can be worked into someone's care plan that are both mindful grounding for the trauma piece, but also culturally rich. And that's really going to be based on that individual and what works for them. Like we said, we do acknowledge that every Indigenous person is very different in terms of their ancestry, how they look, what they value, what they have learned or not learned, and whether they are open to learning more or not is not your decision as a practitioner. It's really just to listen to what they like and trying to guide them in the right direction. So I think I'm going to go to the next slide. What time do we got?
We have 1:42.
Youth, whether you're in a campus setting or not.
Oh, our Wi-Fi just went out again.
You're back up and running now, so if you wanted to start again with your recommendations.
Yeah, so sorry about this. The internet has not been the greatest here for us for the last few days, out of our control. So we're just going to talk about recommendations here. This is more so for people who work in some kind of therapeutic manner with Indigenous youth, whether it's campus, whether it's at a community agency, what have you. It's things that we need to be mindful of. And once again, when we were writing this, we were also keeping in mind that the audience was going to be very diverse and that there might be Indigenous practitioners, people, but there might also be non-Indigenous people, and really trying to encompass everything that we'd like to say. So one of the things is for counselors to be trauma-informed. So this is up and coming, and I think it is going to be the new big thing in social work and in therapy, to be trauma-informed. So nowadays we're the root of depression that might come from it. And that work can be done as well in addition to, but trauma counseling really does encompass those cognitive pieces anyways. So I really do urge you, if you are part of an agency who has any kind of professional development and is able to access that for training, to be able to be trauma informed as a team. So being able to get that certification, there's a couple different places that you can get certified through in different types of trauma modalities, but just having some sort of training in what trauma is, how it impacts someone, and even some tools. Even first stage trauma treatment is great for any person, because you might be a case manager and have someone come in to see you but be very hypo-aroused and having flashbacks, and even having a few kind of tools under your tool belt just to say, have you tried this, or could I suggest this to you, might be of great benefit to your client, right? So just getting to be trauma-informed is one of our #1 recommendations. The second one is universal precautions regarding trauma. So this idea is really that we should assume that everyone has kind of experienced some kind of trauma in their life. So trauma is not about the event, it is about how it's impacted somebody. So if we assume that everyone has had trauma, the worst that will happen is someone hasn't had trauma, but we're still using trauma-informed practice. So this is not just saying, I know you've had trauma. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is using those trauma-informed guidelines, such as consent, right? So always including your client in what you're doing, always letting them know what will be next, always ensuring that they're okay with the work that you're doing and that they're ready for the next steps. Another piece is just asking those questions, right? And not assuming that nothing has gone on. There's some great screenings that you can access. One is Adverse Adult Experiences, I think that's what it's called, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. Yeah. It's called the ACEs screen. And you can, I believe you can probably access it online somewhere. And all it is it's an inventory of someone's experiences. So someone might not be able to say, oh yeah, I have a trauma, but sometimes when you go through the actual questions, they're able to say, yeah, I actually experienced that. And that can be a part where you can do some education around what trauma really is. So just, and the worst that will happen is maybe someone hasn't, which is very unlikely, but maybe they haven't had anything happen in life and they're just having some really organic anxiety issues. But using those same tenets of a trauma-informed practice is still beneficial to them regardless, using those pieces of consent, creating a sense of safety, being able to ask those questions. The next one is using a holistic framework. So as we said, not thinking of mental health on its own, being able to see all the different areas that it impacts and being able to be open to interventions in the different areas. So if you're not Indigenous, first of all, being able to name that, and you're not trying to do Indigenous work with Indigenous youth. What you would then be doing is just listening to what makes sense to them, right? Being able to counsel them in a way that encompasses their worldview, their family, their community, and perhaps doing referrals to someone outside of yourself that might be better equipped to handle whatever that issue is. So say if it's a spiritual issue, maybe if there is an agency that is around that can refer that person to an elder. If you don't know where to access an elder, that might be something that they would benefit from. So using that holistic framework and not seeing anything as separate, being able to see yourself as not that expert. You're really a tool. You're a tool to help them in their wellness and their overall mental health recovery. So you really want to ensure that you're not positioning yourself higher than them, but really saying, okay, I have some knowledge and maybe I have some suggestions that we could try, but really seeing that individual as an expert in their own life, their own experiences, and having that knowledge that they have. Competency in the history of colonization is huge because if you don't have that, there might be a lot of assumptions made. So this isn't you saying to the client, for instance, I know all about colonization. All of this recommendation stuff is more for you as a professional to have and for considerations for you for your own knowledge, right? So you want to make sure you have that history of colonization in the back of your mind so you're able to better conceptualize what is going on for that youth who is just struggling so much, and how that intergenerational piece has now trickled down and now they're experiencing some difficulties. And counselor to work on the self-decolonization, so that reflection about how you think and how you know what you know, and just really taking that apart. There is further information about something like that through many different resources on kind of deep colonial thinking or anti-oppressive practice. And then involving family and counseling where possible. So obviously with youth, they're young people, and as Indigenous youth, they're more likely to be very connected to family and community, and that's most likely to be a great intervention for them where possible. So being able to do that when you can. So then we just talk about social locations, knowing who you are. If you're not Indigenous, trying not to do these pieces of tokenism, right? So kind of thinking that all Indigenous people are the same and that this one-fits-all modality will work for this person. The other piece is appropriation, right? So trying to do Indigenous ceremony, if you're not Indigenous or you've never been taught that, would be very inappropriate. So you're wanting to be very clear to yourself before the client even comes in to know that that is not your place and that it is more so about having that understanding yourself and being able to work with them in a way that makes sense, and then referring outside of what you know is not your expertise. Being an ally, empowerment versus furthering oppression. So once again, positioning yourself as just a tool, and that client is the expert. And often their community is so rich with some resources, whether it's elders, faith keepers, etc. Flexibility with number of sessions and length of time spent with clients. So telling our story as Indigenous people is very important. So for people to interrupt or shorten or try and get to the next thing, that's not empowering. What would be empowering, like I said, is to have witness to the story. Being able to really have some flexibility with how long you're meeting with people, if possible, in your agency, and also how many times you can see them, because also trauma work, especially, compounded many traumas at once. Assisting clients with connecting traditional healing, as I said before, and advocating within the system for elders, Indigenous mentors to be part of services. So for instance, I went to McMaster and...
Okay, folks, it seems like we're having a few technical difficulties. If you just bear with Brittany for a minute, I think they should be back.
It'd be great to see other campuses have something like that.
Our Wi-Fi just went out again.
Yes, you're back now. So it's going in and out a little bit. I will say that we do have about 7 or 8 minutes remaining. So perhaps at this moment we can start moving on towards the questions that we have. But if you wanted to go ahead and wrap up your slides, you can please go ahead and do so.
Yeah, I think we're actually good then. Right?
Yeah, so I think everything has been covered. I know it's been kind of the quick and fast version, but thank you for listening. And I'd like to take some questions now, or we'd like to take some questions. So
great.
We might need some assistance in terms of like where to find them. I think it would just be under chat, but
there's a question section, so I'll just read them out to you.
Okay.
So the first question, the person's remarking, suicide is a spiritual issue. Bringing it up in that way is very fascinating for them. They're asking, do the facilitators recall where they learned or heard about this suicide as a spiritual issue? Was this a traditional teaching? Miigwech for sharing.
I don't know where I've heard it, to be honest. It's something that, I don't know.
I did meet often with an elder when I was a youth and young adult, and we had some discussions around mental health and kind of when you know, people are really not feeling connected here on Earth, and really that idea of feeling that you have nothing here and you really need to go back up to the Creator. And I think also when we started here, some of the previous counselors, this was an idea that they had as well, and it made a lot of sense. So yeah, I think just like, you know, my experience with elders, although those conversations, and for those of you who have had an experience of, you know, obviously meeting with elders, it tends to be quite casual, and so you get a lot of great knowledge, but it's not formally formally introduced to you in any sort of fashion, but also just kind of coming to the Aboriginal Health Center, they had a lot of great ideas already about these things.
Okay. The second question is, have you experienced any instances in working with Inuit peoples where a medicine wheel would not be culturally specific to their people as an assessment? And if so, do you have another way in which you would talk about holistic wellness?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I mean, just because I personally haven't. Have you had that yet, or?
I have not. Let me think.
I don't think. But I was just gonna say, I mean, I mean, it's absolutely right, right? The medicine wheel might not be the thing that makes the most sense for that person. And so I just bring it back to that person and what does make sense for them. because I think it really needs to come from them. So if they're not finding that the medicine wheel is really what connects with them, then just kind of looking into what does make that connection for them, and how do they see their own health in a holistic way.
Yeah, and I think also the holistic piece that we discussed was just kind of how trauma is experienced on all different levels. So you could also ask them that, right? Like how is your trauma experience? Not just about emotions and thoughts, but body sensations and things like that. So it's also the trauma work and how that's more holistic from our approach. But yes, I unfortunately have not had a ton of experience with youth, and I would only imagine that there's vast differences there. So bringing it, very much back to that youth. If there's any, if say I had a client who was working with me on an ongoing basis who was Inuit, and that was very important to them, being able to see if there's any resources from their home communities where I could get further knowledge just to have a better background, but always asking them and allowing them to be the expert, really.
Yeah, and us as learners in that case too, right? So learning from them. Yeah.
And sometimes if the client is teaching, they're also relearning it themselves. So that in itself is still skill building and still building resiliency, I would say.
Yeah.
So I think we have time enough for 2 more questions. So the first one will be, in regards to storytelling, what ways can you acknowledge sharing such sensitive information in a way that's in line with Indigenous practice that doesn't come across as interrupting?
I think just providing that space in a way that, so you're allowing the client to share their story in the way that makes sense for them. And so you're not interjecting with, for example, sometimes people might have negative core beliefs that come out as they're sharing that story, right? But that's not the time for you to say, wait, I'm going to, gently challenge you on that and try to reverse that core belief. It just means that that's the time for that person to really have that space to explore that story and to have someone bear witness to that story in the way that they experienced it. And then afterwards, then you go back and say, oh, I heard this, and I wonder if we can explore this a little further and see if it really makes sense.
So it's more about kind of not that challenging piece, but you're still not in your head. You're still saying, like, that must have been really scary for you. But say, for instance, if someone said, I was sexually assaulted, it was my fault. Of course, as a counselor, in your mind, you're like, red flag, I need to, help them understand a better way of looking at this that is not so shaming and blaming to themselves. But during that period, you're allowing them to just share. They're externalizing at that point. And by doing too much of that challenging, you're interrupting them. You're not allowing them to just really experience that emotion, whether it's rational or not. So I think you can still be present and be nodding your head and saying, wow, that must have been really scary, and saying, yeah, and like just doing all of those kind of active listening skills, all of those validating skills. But the challenging pieces and the more active work I would wait for.
Okay. Would the medicine wheel be an appropriate framework for a non-Indigenous person to use when engaging in counseling an Indigenous client?
So this is something that came up for us last time as well, and it is kind of a tricky thing because I think the medicine wheel can be helpful to non-Indigenous clients too. Like, it's not, like I said, wellness is for everybody, and we all experience all those things. Perhaps our spirituality is something else. Perhaps we don't have a spirituality, but it's still something to note, right? So I think that making sure you know the client, knowing like what would be appropriate for them. It's just seeing how they think, because they might not identify with a holistic method, and maybe they feel offended if you bring it out and assume that. So just not making those assumptions. But you could always be asking the questions. You don't have to necessarily bring out this sheet with the medicine wheel on it, but you could be asking things such as, so I'm hearing that you're having some racing thoughts, and like, usually counselors will ask about emotions too. But how about your physical health, and being able to ask about sleep, weight loss gain, self-care, and body pain? So we really do acknowledge in the Indigenous community that there can be places that we hold our emotions as well. And so if someone's having some back pain or some stomach issues, we sometimes will relate that to some emotional and mental pieces as well. So you can always ask the questions even if you're not bringing out that medicine wheel. But also you can always just gently ask. You can say, I've heard that you told me that you're Indigenous, and I'm wondering if there's any ways of, thinking about your mental health that I should know about, and maybe they'll come out and tell you some more about that. But yeah, you definitely need to be careful, like I said, knowing your social location. And if you're feeling uncomfortable or unsure, I would just ask the questions. And these questions can be asked to non-Native clients as well. So it's not just Indigenous youth, it could be the non-Indigenous youth you see as well.
Okay, so we're starting to come up on the end of our time. Just one final quick question. Is there any specific training for trauma-informed counseling with Indigenous populations that you would recommend?
So not as of right now. However, I wanted to mention that I believe it's the University of Toronto is coming out with a master's in social work specifically to Indigenous, specializing in Indigenous trauma and resiliency. So I'm hoping that they do a lot of great work in this area, and hopefully there'll be more academic resources, as well as just resources in general that can help to speak to some of those things. Yeah, but I wanted to actually share really quickly, because I wasn't able to compile a reading list, but I might do that thereafter, and that can still be accessible, I believe, to you guys, is I wanted to share some books more on holistic trauma practice that can be used with anyone, not just Indigenous people. So like I said, Peter Levine does some amazing work and does something called somatic experiencing trauma work. So if you take a look here, this is called Trauma Through a Child's Eyes, and it's by Peter Levine, Levine, and Maggie Klein, and that's Kline. So Trauma Through a Child's Eyes. He also, all of his books from like Peter Levine, any of his books generally are helpful. Another one I have here is Healing Trauma. This one's a smaller one. It actually comes with a DVD, and it kind of helps with the somatic experiencing exercises. The Body Keeps Us the Score is a great way. I mean, a really great one. And that one's by Bessel van der Kolk. And you might have heard of that one before. That one's pretty well known.
And then there's also in the handouts, there's 2 papers as well that do talk about Indigenous mental health, that I just found to be useful from a kind of counseling point of view as well. So it just kind of goes over a lot of things that we did talk about, but more in depth as well.
And there are lots of trainings. You'd have to look them up because some of them are copyrighted and have to be facilitated by specific people. But there is trainings on something called somatic experiencing, like I've been talking about. There's also where we have gotten a lot of our training around the holistic trauma counseling it's in St. David's, and it's called Attach, but the lengthy name is
Attachment and Trauma Center for Healing.
Yeah,
I think.
Attachment and Trauma Treatment Center for Healing. And Lori Gill is there, and she does amazing trainings for all different areas, whether you're in a school setting, child welfare setting, whether you're just wanting a one-day workshop just to get an idea, but you don't really want to do the counseling piece. There's also a lot of resources in Toronto for trauma counseling certifications. I'm sure people have heard of EMDR. That's more of a lengthy one. But that is very in connecting mind and body, I would say, as well, because you do have the tappers and eye movements. There's also Hinksdale-Crest has level 1 and 2 of just a trauma counseling certificate for frontline workers, which would be great, I would say, especially for anyone working in, say, women's services, anyone working with high populations of, youth, or anyone in a frontline position where you might not be exclusively doing that type of work, but it would be great to have that background. Even just doing the level 1 would be great.
Okay, perfect. So we are coming up on the end of our webinar. I will just say thank you very much to both of you for presenting with us today. I really wanted to also thank all of our attendees for their very insightful questions. I just wanted to point your attention to our website, campusmentalhealth.ca, and on this website you will be able to find the collection of resources that our 2 presenters made available to you today. The handouts are available on PDF and will be uploaded on the website. You also have their slides that they used for today's presentation, so if you had anything useful that you wanted to pull from there, that will be made available to you. And finally, there will be a recording of this entire webinar that will be uploaded to the website, so campusmentalhealth.ca. And I just wanted to draw your attention there as well. If you actually go to the website. You can also join our mailing list if you enter your email into the field right over here. And essentially, we are going to be continuing having our webinars at the end of every month. So if you would please just ensure to complete the survey that we have available. That would be something that we find very useful to actually have some of your feedback and be able to make sure that we are doing a good job at the webinar. So thank you very much to both of our presenters again today, and thank you for all of our attendees, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.